Imagine for a second, right, that you are the founder and CEO of a brand new, highly ambitious startup,
Okay, I'm with you.
but you have zero capital in the bank.
Yeah.
And your closest competitors, well, they're just trying to outmarket you. They are actively trying to destroy your infrastructure and literally run you out of business.
That is a stressful startup environment.
Right. To survive, you absolutely need external funding and protection. So you go to a massive global venture capital firm. But here is the catch, and it's a big one.
That's always a catch.
Exactly. The board of this VC firm changes its leadership completely every 4 to 8 years. Every single time a new managing partner takes the corner office, they bring in an entirely different philosophy.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, completely different investment priorities. And more often than not, they actively despise everything the previous partner built.
So you have no stability whatsoever.
None. To keep your startup alive, you have to continually adapt, negotiate, and maneuver with this rotating cast of unpredictable characters. And you have to do all of this without losing your own core moral compass or selling out your fundamental mission.
I mean, that sounds less like running a business and more like some kind of psychological torture experiment.
It really does.
You would have to possess an almost superhuman level of adaptability and, frankly, an incredibly thick skin.
Which is precisely the kind of historical journey we are taking you on today. Except the stakes we are talking about aren't corporate profits or market share.
Right. The stakes are so much higher.
We're talking about the survival of a newly born nation, the liberation of an entire continent from colonial rule, and, the avoidance of a global proxy war involving nuclear superpowers.
Just a casual Tuesday.
Right. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are unpacking an absolutely fascinating book. It's called Kenneth Kaunda, The United States and Southern Africa by historian Andy DeRoche.
It's an incredible piece of research.
It really is. Our mission for this deep dive is to explore how one African leader, Kenneth Kaunda, the first president of Zambia, widely known simply as KK, managed to intimately shape U.S. foreign policy across a staggering 8 different American presidential administrations.
Spanning from John F. Kennedy all the way through to George H.W. Bush, and even extending his influence into the George W. Bush years. I mean, it is a timeline that covers the most volatile decades of the 20th century.
We're talking about navigating the frozen paranoia of the Cold War, surviving active proxy battles, and leading the ultimate fight against apartheid.
Exactly.
If you have ever wondered how smaller players exert real, tangible leverage over massive, seemingly immovable institutions, whether that's in global geopolitics or, your own corporate boardroom, Kaunda's story is the ultimate playbook.
And the overarching theme that emerges from DeRoche's sources and the concept you really need to keep in mind as we go through this is Kaunda's strict adherence to a strategy called non-alignment.
Non-alignment. Let's unpack that because it's crucial.
Right. So to Washington, D.C., especially during the peak of the Cold War, non-alignment often looked incredibly suspicious.
Yeah, it looked like a dangerous, unpredictable flirtation with communism to them.
Precisely. But if you look at the mechanics of the situation from Kaunda's perspective in Lusaka, it was a pure, highly pragmatic survival strategy. I mean, Zambia was a brand new, landlocked nation.
Surrounded by enemies.
Exactly. Look at a map of southern Africa in the 1960s. Zambia was completely surrounded by hostile, heavily armed white minority regimes. You had Rhodesia, South Africa, and the Portuguese colonies of Angola and Mozambique.
So Kaunda wasn't playing ideological games just for the fun of it.
No, not at all. He was playing a high-stakes, multi-generational long game just for his country's survival.
Let's ground this by looking at where Kaunda started, because before he could, negotiate in the Oval Office, he had to build a nation from scratch. We need to rewind to the 1950s.
Back when the country of Zambia didn't even exist yet.
Right. It's a British colony known as Northern Rhodesia. And the demographic and political reality is harsh. You've got a small white minority holding massive economic and political power over the black majority.
It was a system that closely mirrored the apartheid state down in South Africa.
Exactly. And in 1953, Kenneth Kaunda is a young school teacher. He becomes an organizer for the African National Congress, the ANC. And the way he begins his major political journey is almost cinematic. I mean, he literally starts on a bicycle.
He really does. In July of 1953, he gets on his bicycle and begins a grueling, massive physical journey from the northern provinces all the way down to the capital, Lusaka, just to attend the ANC's annual conference.
And we shouldn't gloss over the physical reality of that.
Definitely not. The infrastructure in northern Rhodesia at that time was designed to extract copper, not to facilitate grassroots political organizing. That kind of physical dedication, pedaling through the bush to build a coalition, it really set the operational tone for his entire career.
Wow. And he is quickly chosen as the party's Secretary General.
Yeah. Yes. And over the next decade, the political landscape shifts rapidly. Kaunda breaks away from the older, more conservative ANC leadership to form a more robust, aggressive independence movement.
Which naturally makes him a target.
Oh, absolutely. He gets banned by the colonial authorities, he gets arrested, he even serves 9 months of hard labor in a Rhodesian prison.
But he doesn't break.
No, by 1960, he emerges from that crucible as the president of the newly formed United National Independence Party, or UNIP.
I want to pause on 1960, because that is the year Kaunda first registers on the radar of the United States establishment.
A pivotal year.
Right. He is invited to New York to attend an event called Africa Freedom Day. And while he's in the U.S., he has a meeting that fundamentally shapes his approach to American relations. He meets Martin Luther King Jr.
That meeting is so incredibly important.
The two of them bond deeply. MLK even welcomes Kaunda to his church in Atlanta. They connect over a shared profound belief in nonviolence as a tool for political liberation.
And that shared philosophy is the mechanical lever that really opens doors for Kaunda in America. You have to understand the American psychological landscape in 1960.
You're terrified.
Absolutely terrified of Third World revolutionaries. They are looking at Fidel Castro taking over Cuba just 90 miles from Florida. They are looking at Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam. The prevailing assumption in Washington is that anti-colonial movements are inherently violent and inherently communist.
But Kaunda offered a completely different paradigm.
Exactly. He wasn't preaching violent revolution. He was preaching passive resistance, moral justice, and democratic transitions.
And the American media eats this up. I mean, Life magazine runs a massive, highly flattering profile on him.
Right. And we have to remember who was publishing Life at the time. Henry Luce?
Yes. Henry Luce, who was essentially the architect of mainstream, strident American anti-communist media.
That's the guy.
And his magazine photographs Kaunda visiting everyday Americans standing reverently before the Lincoln Memorial. They explicitly brand him as a soft-spoken believer in nonviolence.
The strategic value of that Life magazine endorsement cannot be overstated. It was the geopolitical equivalent of a blue-chip stock rating.
I love that comparison.
Well, it's true. Luce's endorsement provided Kaunda with instant, bulletproof credibility among the American political elite. It signaled to the halls of power in Washington that Kenneth Kaunda was a safe, rational, democratic alternative to the Marxist revolutionaries popping up elsewhere.
Which perfectly sets the stage for 1961. Kaunda gets a face-to-face meeting with President John F. Kennedy at the White House.
A huge milestone.
And from the sources, it's clear Kaunda is incredibly impressed by JFK. He feels like he has found a true ideological ally in the U.S. government, a leader who actually understands the moral imperative of African independence.
And the feeling was largely mutual. The U.S. intelligence apparatus starts predicting Kaunda will inevitably be the first president of an independent Zambia.
Which he successfully achieves in October 1964. But then, the geopolitical chessboard flips.
Tragically, yes.
JFK is assassinated. Lyndon B. Johnson takes over. And Kaunda's relationship with the U.S. hits a brick wall.
A complete brick wall. A month after Zambia's official independence in late 1964, Kaunda returns to Washington to meet with LBJ. And the contrast couldn't have been sharper.
LBJ was his focus was entirely elsewhere.
Entirely consumed by the rapidly escalating conflict in Vietnam, the administrative bandwidth of the U.S. government simply has no room for Southern Africa. To LBJ, Africa is just a low-priority distraction.
There's this one detail from the source material that blows my mind. During that visit, Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State, actually scolds the Zambian delegation.
Oh, the lecture on military spending.
Yes, he lectures them on prioritizing military spending over domestic development. I'm struggling to understand the sheer blindness of that lecture from Dean Rusk.
It is baffling in hindsight.
How does the U.S. Secretary of State sit across from the leader of a landlocked country, a country that shares a massive porous border with the heavily armed, hostile, white minority rebel regime of Ian Smith in Rhodesia, and tell them they shouldn't spend money on their military? Zambia is literally on the front line of a looming racial war.
It reveals a profound structural flaw in U.S. foreign policy at the time, a total lack of contextual empathy.
Contextual empathy, that's a great way to put it.
Washington was viewing the entire globe through the single lens of the U.S.-Soviet conflict. They saw military spending in a developing nation as a sign of instability or Soviet alignment. They completely ignored the localized existential threat Kaunda faced from his immediate neighbor.
Well, if LBJ was a cold shower, Richard Nixon was a locked door. By 1970, Nixon is in power, and he completely snubs Kaunda.
Just refuses to see him.
Point blank refuses to give Kaunda an Oval Office meeting. Nixon's entire foreign policy bandwidth is focused on orchestrating detente with the Soviets and opening relations with China.
And it gets worse for Zambia.
It does. The U.S. Congress passes the Byrd Amendment, which lifts sanctions on white-ruled Rhodesia so the U.S. can import Rhodesian chrome, critical mineral for the aerospace and defense industries.
Right.
So the U.S. is actively ignoring Kaunda, insulting him diplomatically and economically propping up his worst enemy. I have to ask, at this point, why didn't Kaunda just throw his hands up, completely abandon the West, and fully align with the Soviet Union, like so many other leaders did?
Because that would have violated his core doctrine of non-alignment, and frankly, it would have been bad long-term strategy. Kaunda understood that swapping a British colonial master for a Soviet ideological master wasn't true independence.
He wanted his own path.
Exactly. He maintained a bold, incredibly stubborn balancing act. For instance, let's talk about the railway.
Oh, the Tazara Railroad. This is fascinating.
Right, so Zambia desperately needed a railway to the sea to export its copper. Relying on the railways going south through hostile Rhodesia and apartheid South Africa was strategic suicide.
Obviously, you can't rely on your enemies to ship your goods.
So Kaunda asks the U.S. and Britain to fund a new railway going east through Tanzania. They looked at the numbers, deemed it unprofitable, and said no.
And Kaunda doesn't just accept defeat here, he pivots in a way that gives Washington absolute heart palpitations.
Precisely. He turns to the People's Republic of China.
Wow.
The Chinese government, eager to build influence and show solidarity with the Third World, agrees to fund and build the massive Tazara Railroad. They send thousands of workers and finish it years ahead of schedule.
Which is an incredible feat.
And around the same time, Kaunda votes no on the Global Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Wait, really? Why would he do that?
Because South Africa was actively developing a nuclear program, and Kaunda wanted to keep his options open for a deterrent.
That is so pragmatic.
To the Nixon administration, bringing in the Chinese and voting against nuclear treaties looked completely reckless. But to Zambian diplomats, this was the epitome of realism.
But he never actually cuts the cord with the Americans, does he? Even while building railways with the Chinese, he's still trying to keep a channel open to Washington.
He never gave up on American democratic ideals, which is a fascinating psychological element of his leadership. He was deeply, profoundly frustrated by U.S. policy, which he viewed as a bizarre, hypocritical form of moral non-alignment in the face of blatant racism in Southern Africa.
Yeah, the hypocrisy was glaring.
He looked at America in the late 60s and early 70s and saw a country tearing itself apart, the Vietnam protests, the assassinations of his friend MLK and Robert Kennedy. Yet he still held on to the core values he discussed with JFK.
So his non-alignment wasn't an abandonment of the West at all.
No, it was a pragmatic necessity. He needed to keep his country functioning, and if the West wouldn't help build the infrastructure, he would find someone who would without permanently burning the bridge back to Washington.
Okay, so we have a leader who has been systematically ignored by the Nixon administration. How does Kenneth Kaunda suddenly become the absolute center of Washington's attention by the mid-1970s? What changes the math?
A massive geopolitical earthquake, completely outside of Kaunda's control. In April 1974, the Carnation Revolution hits Portugal. A military coup in Lisbon overthrows the right-wing authoritarian dictatorship that had ruled for decades.
And the immediate mechanical consequence of that coup is that the new Portuguese government decides they are done with their empire.
They want out.
They announce they are rapidly pulling out of their African colonies, specifically Mozambique and Angola. And for decades, those Portuguese colonies acted as a massive geographic buffer zone, protecting white-ruled Rhodesia and South Africa from the independent black nations to the north.
Right. They insulated the apartheid regimes.
But overnight, that buffer evaporates. The region is plunged into a chaotic power vacuum. And suddenly, the geopolitical map of Southern Africa is on fire, and Washington realizes, oh wait, we desperately need someone stable in the region. They finally look at Kenneth Kaunda.
Gerald Ford has taken over the White House following Nixon's resignation. Ford and his incredibly powerful Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, invite Kaunda to Washington in April 1975. And Kaunda does not show up just to smile for the camera.
No, he does not.
He arrives with a meticulously planned agenda and a willingness to break diplomatic norms.
The scene at the White House is wild if you understand protocol.
It really is.
Picture it. It's a formal state dinner, black tie, crystal glasses, the absolute height of polite diplomatic theater. The President of the United States and the Secretary of State are sitting right there. Kaunda stands up to give his toast, and instead of offering the usual platitudes, he drops a bombshell.
A massive bombshell.
He delivers a speech publicly scolding the United States government. He states, on the record, in the White House, that America has not had a coherent moral policy toward Africa since the Kennedy administration. He pulls zero punches.
It was a calculated risk that deeply ruffled feathers in the room. Kissinger, who was used to managing client states, was visibly shocked by the audacity.
I can imagine Kissinger's face.
Oh, I'm sure he was seething. But Kaunda's raw public honesty achieved its intended mechanical consequence. It forced the issue. It grabbed Ford's attention entirely. The very next day, in the Oval Office, the polite diplomatic dance was over. They had an intense hour-long working session focused almost entirely on the erupting violent civil war next door in Angola.
We need to unpack the mechanics of the Angola crisis, because it is a layered mess of proxy warfare. As the Portuguese withdraw, three competing, heavily armed nationalist factions are fighting for control of the country.
Right.
You have the MPLA, led by Agostinho Neto, who is receiving backing and weapons from the Soviet Union. You have the FNLA, led by Holden Roberto, who is backed by neighboring Zaire. And finally, you have UNITA, led by Jonas Savimbi.
This is where Kaunda's pragmatism is severely tested. You have to ask, who does Kaunda back and why?
Right, because his choice is surprising.
Kaunda actually decides to support Jonas Savimbi and UNITA, but it is crucial to understand that this wasn't out of some deep ideological love for Savimbi. Kaunda evaluated the chessboard and saw Savimbi as a pragmatic compromise candidate.
He just wanted stability.
Exactly. Kaunda's primary overarching goal was to force all three factions into a coalition government. He wanted to prevent Angola from turning into a massive, heavily armed proxy war right on Zambia's 1,000-kilometer western border.
Makes total sense.
If one faction won outright, especially the Soviet-backed MPLA, Kaunda feared it would destabilize the whole region. But Washington's intelligence apparatus misinterprets Kaunda's maneuvering completely.
Right. Kissinger and Ford look at the map and don't see nuance. They see a binary Cold War equation. They hear, oh, Kaunda wants Savimbi in power, and the Soviets are backing Neto. So the U.S. executive branch decides to act.
And they act covertly.
They do. The CIA launches a major covert operation, secretly funneling millions of dollars in money and weapons to Roberto and Savimbi to counter the Soviets. And this operation turns into an absolute unmitigated disaster.
The mechanics of the escalation are terrifying. By pumping covert weapons into the FNLA and UNITA, the U.S. intervention prompts the Soviet Union to massively increase their shipments of heavy artillery to the MPLA.
It's a classic escalation spiral.
And then Cuba enters the fray, sending thousands of combat troops to back the MPLA. It ceases to be a civil war and escalates into a full-blown international proxy conflict.
Wow.
And the apartheid government of South Africa even invades southern Angola, ostensibly to fight the Cubans and the MPLA, which completely poisons the political legitimacy of anyone associated with them, including Savimbi.
And back in Washington, the political machinery jams. This is post-Watergate, post-Vietnam. The U.S. Congress discovers this covert CIA operation in Angola, and they are furious.
They pull the plug.
Yep. They pass the Tunney Amendment, which completely cuts off all U.S. funding for the operation, legally tying the hands of Ford and Kissinger. Left without U.S. backing, the FNLA and UNITA collapse under the weight of the Cuban and Soviet-backed MPLA.
The MPLA takes control of the capital, Luanda. Kaunda's worst fear is realized, and he is forced to swallow an incredibly bitter pill and formally recognize the MPLA government in 1976 just to maintain border stability.
But the fallout from this Angolan disaster provides the setup for perhaps Kaunda's most brilliant piece of diplomatic leverage. Let's go back to that 1975 White House visit. After his meetings with Ford and Kissinger wrap up, Kaunda heads to the airport.
This is such a great story.
But instead of flying his presidential jet back to Zambia, he intentionally has his pilot file a flight plan directly from Washington, D.C. to Havana, Cuba, for a personal meeting with Fidel Castro.
The audacity of that move is incredible. The U.S. air traffic controllers were reportedly stunned.
I mean, filing a flight plan from the capitalist world straight to the heart of the communist Caribbean. It is the ultimate diplomatic flex.
It really is.
He is broadcasting a very clear message to Washington. He's saying, I am not your client state. I operate independently. But beyond the theatrics, there is a deeply strategic mechanism at play here.
Oh, absolutely.
He is using the American fear of further Soviet and Cuban expansion in Africa to force Henry Kissinger to take action on the next exploding crisis, which is Rhodesia.
This is a masterclass in realpolitik. Kissinger is watching Angola fall to a Marxist government backed by Cuban troops, and he is absolutely terrified that if the civil war in white-ruled Rhodesia escalates, the Cubans and Soviets will jump in there too.
And Kaunda sees this fear and weaponizes it.
He essentially corners Kissinger and says, if you do not want the communists to win the entire continent, you must use American leverage to pressure the white minority regime of Ian Smith in Rhodesia to accept majority rule.
Even other African leaders recognized Kaunda's leverage, didn't they?
Yes, President Mobutu of Zaire told Kissinger point blank during a meeting, if you want to solve this, you need to have Kaunda's support.
So Kissinger, the ultimate calculating Cold Warrior who previously treated Africa as an irrelevant backwater, suddenly becomes a frequent flyer to Lusaka.
He has to.
In April 1976, Kissinger travels to Zambia and delivers a watershed speech. It is a massive pivot in U.S. foreign policy. Kissinger unequivocally commits the United States to supporting majority rule in Southern Africa. He engages in intense, exhausting shuttle diplomacy, working hand in glove with Kaunda.
And the mechanical strategy there is to get the U.S. to pressure South Africa so that South Africa will cut off supply lines to Rhodesia, forcing Ian Smith to the negotiating table.
It was a monumental structural shift.
And as a thank you for Kaunda's cooperation in managing the regional optics, Kissinger promised significant bilateral economic aid to Zambia. Now, they didn't magically solve the Rhodesian crisis that year. Ian Smith proved to be incredibly stubborn and deeply entrenched. But Kaunda successfully managed to use America's binary fear of communism to extract a tangible public commitment to racial justice and diplomatic intervention.
But just as Kaunda figures out how to play Kissinger's game of cold, calculating realpolitik, the rules change again. The 1976 U.S. presidential election brings a completely different philosophy to the White House.
Enter Jimmy Carter.
Right, Jimmy Carter wins. And he replaces Kissinger's raw balance of power calculus with a foreign policy fundamentally centered on a moral crusade for human rights. And initially, Kaunda finds this shift incredibly refreshing.
The beginning of the Carter administration really felt like a honeymoon phase for U.S.-Zambian relations. Carter takes immediate, symbolic, and practical steps.
He appoints Andrew Young, right?
Yes, he appoints Andrew Young, a prominent former civil rights leader and a close associate of Martin Luther King Jr., as the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. And one of the administration's first major legislative pushes is to repeal the Byrd Amendment, officially reinstating the ban on importing Rhodesian chrome.
So Zambian officials were absolutely thrilled. It felt like the idealism of the JFK era had finally returned to Washington.
If you look at the optics of this relationship in 1978, it is beautiful. Kaunda visits Carter at the White House in May. The speeches on the lawn are incredibly warm.
Carter publicly calls Kaunda a partner and a close friend.
And Kaunda is so moved by the reception that he brings his entire delegation out, picks up a guitar, and starts leading them in singing the Zambian freedom song Tiende Pamadzi, which translates to, "Let us go forward together."
It was the absolute pinnacle of goodwill. Carter genuinely, deeply respected Kaunda's moral persistence and his commitment to liberation. Carter felt he had found a kindred spirit on the continent.
But behind the music, the speeches, and the smiles, the structural reality on the ground in Zambia was biting hard.
Yeah, things were not going well at home.
The Zambian economy was in a state of total freefall. We have to explain the mechanics of this. Zambia's economy was essentially a monoculture. It relied entirely on the global price of copper.
And in the mid-1970s, due to global recessions and oil shocks, the price of copper completely plummeted.
Overnight, the government's revenue evaporated. And on top of that macroeconomic disaster, Kaunda was spending massive amounts of state funds hosting various liberation fighters. You had the Zipporah forces fighting Rhodesia, the ANC fighting South Africa.
And in retaliation, Rhodesian and South African military forces were actively crossing the border and bombing Zambian infrastructure.
This economic devastation forces Kaunda into an agonizing corner. Let's look at the logistics. To economically isolate the racist regime in Rhodesia, Kaunda had taken a principled stand in 1973 and completely closed the railway border with them.
Which was a massive sacrifice because it choked off his own imports and exports.
By late 1978, the situation reaches a breaking point. Zambia is facing a catastrophic shortage of fertilizer. 150,000 tons of U.S.-provided fertilizer are sitting on docks in ports in Tanzania and Mozambique.
Just sitting there.
But the alternative railway routes are too congested and inefficient to move that volume in time. If that fertilizer doesn't get into the Zambian soil before the rainy season starts, the crops will fail, and the Zambian people will literally starve.
So Kaunda has to make a brutal calculation. He has to swallow his immense pride, anger his ideological allies in Tanzania and Mozambique, and actually reopen the railway running south straight through enemy territory Rhodesia just to get the American fertilizer into his country.
It was a stark, painful moment where the mechanics of state survival completely overpowered ideological principle. He simply had to feed his citizens.
Of course.
But the crisis wasn't just agricultural. The military situation was equally dire, if not worse. Rhodesian forces were acting with impunity. They were flying deep into Zambian airspace and launching devastating bombing raids on nationalist refugee camps and military installations.
And Kaunda's military was vastly outgunned.
He desperately needed advanced air defense systems to protect his sovereign airspace. So he turns to his friend Jimmy Carter and begs the U.S. for weapons to defend his country.
And Carter, the friend who sang songs with him on the lawn, says no.
He says no.
Carter cites his administration's strict global anti-arms proliferation policy. He offers Kaunda humanitarian aid, he offers medical supplies, but he absolutely refuses to provide lethal weapons or air defense systems.
Well, the fundamental clash of priorities.
I mean, Carter was basically that friend we all have, the one who gives you amazing, deep moral support and tells you they believe in your cause. But the second you are facing eviction and need cash for rent, they suddenly have a strict personal policy against lending money. Principles are fantastic on paper, but Kaunda had a country that was actively being bombed.
That is the perfect way to understand Kaunda's frustration. This specific incident synthesizes a crucial lesson in international relations. Shared moral values like a mutual commitment to human rights or racial equality cannot always overcome structural state interests.
Right.
Carter's rigid doctrine on arms proliferation, designed to make the world safer, inadvertently created a massive, deadly security vacuum for Zambia.
Since Carter won't sell him the weapons, Kaunda is forced to look elsewhere. He goes to the Soviet Union. He purchases a massive quantity of highly expensive Soviet MiG fighter jets to establish a deterrent against the Rhodesian bombings.
And this decision triggers a massive falling out with Washington.
By early 1980, the warm guitar-playing honeymoon is completely over. Carter's administration is harshly criticizing Kaunda for introducing advanced Soviet weaponry into the region, and Kaunda is deeply hurt and disappointed that his supposed American friend abandoned him when his people were dying.
It is a profound, tragic irony. The American administration that was arguably the most ideologically and morally aligned with Kaunda's vision for racial equality ended up pushing him further into military and financial dependence on the Soviet bloc, simply because of its strict adherence to a completely separate policy goal regarding arms control.
And as the decade turns, the political pendulum in America swings violently again. Jimmy Carter is swept out of office in a landslide. The 1980 election brings Ronald Reagan to power, and the Reagan administration brings an entirely new, deeply controversial mechanical framework for dealing with Southern Africa.
The era of human rights crusades is definitively over.
The Reagan era introduces Chester Crocker, the new Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. Crocker is an academic who institutes a highly structured policy known as constructive engagement.
No, constructive engagement is a term that requires deep unpacking.
Because to a lot of activists and observers at the time, constructive engagement sounded like a very polite euphemism for actively collaborating with the apartheid regime.
That was the immediate and persistent criticism from the international community. But let's look at Crocker's theoretical premise. The mechanics of constructive engagement were based on the idea that the United States could wield significantly more influence over the South African government by cooperating with them.
By communicating with them and treating them as a regional partner.
Right, rather than turning them into a global pariah through sanctions and isolation. Crocker genuinely believed that through patient, quiet diplomacy, he could persuade Pretoria to initiate internal racial reforms and, crucially, agree to grant independence to the territory of Namibia, which South Africa was occupying.
But there is a massive structural catch to Crocker's plan regarding Namibia, right? A policy condition called linkage.
Yes. The Reagan administration instituted linkage. They explicitly stated that the United States would only support pressure on South Africa to withdraw its military from Namibia if and when the Cuban troops withdrew from Angola.
They linked the two separate conflicts together into one grand Cold War bargain.
And Kaunda is absolutely infuriated by this logic.
I mean, from his perspective, it's madness. He asks the Americans, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Let's break down Kaunda's view here. The Cuban troops were only in Angola in the first place to protect the Angolan government from repeated invasions by the South African military.
Exactly.
Tying the basic human right of Namibian independence to the movements of Cold War chess pieces in Angola felt insulting. It felt like Washington was holding African liberation hostage just to score points against Moscow.
It was deeply offensive to Kaunda and the other leaders of the frontline states, and the bilateral friction didn't stop at policy disagreements. In 1981, U.S.-Zambia relations hit absolute rock bottom.
What happened?
Kaunda's security apparatus uncovers a suspected, complex coup plot against his government. The investigation leads Kaunda to publicly expel 2 American diplomats from Lusaka, accusing them of being CIA operatives involved in espionage and subversion.
So within a few short years, we go from playing freedom songs on the White House lawn to kicking alleged CIA agents out of the country.
Talk about whiplash.
But true to his pragmatic doctrine of non-alignment, Kaunda does not burn the bridge to Washington entirely. He lets the temperature cool, and by 1983, diplomatic relations are repaired just enough for Kaunda to secure a visit with President Reagan at the White House.
The 1983 meeting is a fascinating study in political theater. Outwardly, it is very polite. They both smile for the press cameras. Reagan gives a speech praising Kaunda as a respected senior African statesman.
But privately,
Behind closed doors, it was a disaster. Kaunda later confided to an aide that he felt he got absolutely nowhere. He spent an hour passionately explaining the dire life-and-death struggle against apartheid, detailing the violence and the economic strangulation.
and how did Reagan respond?
Reagan's primary response was to breezily suggest that the U.S. and Zambia should do business together to foster economic growth. Kaunda walked away feeling that Reagan fundamentally lacked any real political will or moral urgency to solve the crisis of white minority rule.
Imagine pouring your heart out about a generational struggle for basic human rights, and the response is, hey, let's talk about foreign direct investment. It must have sounded incredibly hollow.
Extremely hollow.
Yet, despite his deep misgivings about Reagan's administration, Kaunda keeps pushing the diplomatic levers. He refuses to give up. He actually hosts major peace talks in his capital, Lusaka, in 1984, trying to broker a ceasefire agreement between South Africa and Angola, working directly alongside Chester Crocker.
Even when he despised the policy, the man simply refused to abandon the diplomatic channel.
Because he understood that without American logistical and diplomatic weight, nothing in the region would permanently change. He was a pragmatist to his core.
Eventually, the clock runs out on the Reagan administration. In 1989, George H.W. Bush takes office. Bush Sr. is actually an old personal friend of Kaunda's. They knew each other quite well from their time serving together as ambassadors at the United Nations back in the early 1970s.
So there was a real relationship there.
Yes, Kaunda visits the White House one last time as a sitting president, and there is a genuine interpersonal warmth there. Bush assures Kaunda that the U.S. will fully support the final implementation of the agreements leading to Namibian independence.
But there's a tragic divergence happening here. While Kaunda's international prestige is holding steady and he is finally seeing the fruits of his labor regarding Namibia, his foundation at home in Zambia is completely crumbling beneath his feet.
The domestic situation was dire.
The 1980s have been an era of severe economic devastation for the country. The national debt is astronomical. The one-party state system that Kaunda has ruled over with an iron grip for over 2 decades is facing massive, organized resistance from trade unions and civil society.
And then the IMF gets involved.
Right. To satisfy the demands of the IMF and the World Bank for loan restructuring, the Zambian government is forced to implement structural adjustment programs. In 1990, this leads to the removal of government subsidies on mealie meal, which is the ground corn staple food that forms the base of the Zambian diet.
And when the subsidies are cut, the price of food jumps over 100%, almost overnight.
The mechanics of that price shock are the tipping point. It sparks deadly, widespread riots across the country. Students, union workers, and everyday citizens take to the streets demanding a return to multi-party democracy and demanding Kaunda's immediate resignation.
Furthermore, the global geopolitical landscape is shifting radically. The Cold War is ending. The Berlin Wall has fallen.
The boogeyman is gone.
Exactly. The historical justification Kaunda used for maintaining a strongman one-party state, the need for total internal unity to fend off the regional threats of apartheid and Cold War subversion is suddenly vanishing.
The pressure becomes insurmountable. Kaunda is finally forced to concede and organize multi-party democratic elections in October 1991. Now, what's wild is that Kaunda genuinely believes he's going to win.
He really did.
He has been the father of the nation for 27 years. He is so supremely confident in his domestic popularity that he personally invites his old friend, former U.S. President Jimmy Carter, to lead the international delegation monitoring the election to prove to the world that it's fair.
It is a stunning, deeply humbling moment in history. The man who guided Zambia to independence, who stubbornly fought and negotiated with 8 different U.S. presidents to liberate Southern Africa, finally faces the unvarnished judgment of his own electorate.
And he loses.
Yeah.
In an absolute landslide.
Frederick Chiluba, a charismatic former union leader, sweeps the election, taking roughly 75% of the popular vote.
There is an incredibly poignant detail from the sources. As the vote tallies roll in and the magnitude of the defeat becomes clear, Kaunda weeps. It is a devastating personal blow.
It had to have been heartbreaking.
But with Jimmy Carter actively mediating the transition behind the scenes, Kaunda makes a choice that cements his legacy. He goes on national television and gracefully, peacefully concedes defeat. He tells the nation, "You win some and you lose some." After 27 years of continuous, highly centralized power, he steps down without firing a shot.
If we pull back and look at the mechanics of his downfall, Kaunda's domestic policies and his international ambitions finally collided. He spent hundreds of millions of dollars of state revenue, and he allowed his country to suffer devastating infrastructure bombings, all to fight apartheid and colonial rule in neighboring countries.
It was an undeniably noble, historic cause.
But the resulting economic stagnation, the crushing debt, and the lack of domestic investment cost him his own presidency.
I think we have to ask the difficult question here. What does this mean for his legacy? Was his foreign policy strategy actually a success if the ultimate price was the economic ruin of his own country?
That is the ultimate defining paradox of Kenneth Kaunda. On the international stage, his mechanical strategy of non-alignment and relentless pressure was instrumental in liberating an entire continent.
True.
Without his willingness to host liberation movements, without his constant diplomatic maneuvering between Washington and Moscow, the falls of minority rule in Rhodesia, Namibia, and eventually South Africa might have taken decades longer and cost exponentially more blood.
But domestically, his own citizens were forced to pay a massive, grueling, multi-generational economic price to subsidize that regional liberation.
Yeah.
He was an undisputed hero abroad, but he was emphatically voted out of office at home. For most politicians, getting voted out in a landslide is the end of the narrative. You write a ghostwritten memoir, you join a few corporate boards, you give some highly paid speeches.
The usual retirement tour.
Exactly. But for Kenneth Kaunda, stepping out of the presidency didn't lead to a quiet retirement. It led him into the most difficult, deeply personal battle of his entire life.
The initial post-presidency years were incredibly hostile. The new president, Frederick Chiluba, did not offer Kaunda a graceful retirement. He actively persecuted him.
It was vindictive.
Chiluba's government went so far as to engineer a change to the Zambian constitution specifically designed to ban Kaunda from running for president again in the 1996 elections.
They changed the constitution just to stop him.
Yes. They added a highly targeted clause requiring both parents of any presidential candidate to have been born within the borders of Zambia. Because Kaunda's parents were missionaries born in neighboring Malawi, the founding father of the nation was legally disqualified from running for office.
The pettiness of that is staggering. The man who literally negotiated the borders and the independence of the country is banned on a retroactive technicality.
Chiluba's government even places Kaunda under house arrest for a time and briefly attempts to legally strip him of his Zambian citizenship. It is an organized campaign of humiliation.
But instead of letting this destroy him, Kaunda pivots. He realizes his political career is over, so he takes all of that accumulated global moral authority and aims it squarely at a new invisible enemy that is beginning to devastate the African continent, the HIV/AIDS epidemic.
And this chapter is where his leadership truly transcends traditional state politics. We have to go back slightly to 1989 while he was still president. Kaunda flew to Canada to speak at the International AIDS Conference in Montreal.
That speech was monumental.
He delivered a chillingly prescient speech, warning the global community that the disease was acting as a soft nuclear bomb across the developing world. But the mechanical lever he used to break the issue open wasn't just rhetoric.
No, it was deeply personal.
He became the first African head of state to stand on a global stage and publicly admit that the disease had struck his own family. He revealed that his son, Masuzio, had died of AIDS in 1986.
If you think about the social context of the 1980s and early 90s, the stigma surrounding HIV/AIDS was absolute. It was suffocating.
Absolutely suffocating.
For a sitting African president in a deeply conservative culture to stand up in front of the world and share that level of deeply personal, deeply stigmatized tragedy, it was a groundbreaking mechanism for change.
It completely shattered the wall of silence. After leaving political office, he dedicated the remainder of his life to this specific cause. He founded the Kenneth Kaunda Children of Africa Foundation, primarily focused on providing logistical and financial support for the millions of children orphaned by the AIDS epidemic.
He was tireless.
His advocacy was so relentless that in 2002, he moved to the United States to become the first president in residence at Boston University. He used that academic platform to lecture across the country, constantly raising awareness and lobbying for resources to fight the epidemic in Africa.
And in 2003, his incredible decades-long journey with United States presidents comes full circle one last time. He is invited back to Washington, D.C., back to the White House by President George W. Bush.
A beautiful moment.
The occasion is the signing of the PEPFAR Act, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which was a massive multi-billion-dollar U.S. initiative to combat global AIDS. President Bush publicly honors Kaunda's lifetime of service and specifically praises his foundation's groundbreaking work. After all the bitter Cold War fights over weapons and ideology, it's an incredible, unifying redemption arc.
It really forces us to redefine the mechanics of leadership. Kaunda proved that a statesman's ability to shape the world isn't strictly tied to their holding of political office, their control of a military, or their grip on a domestic economy.
He just kept fighting.
He took the exact same moral persistence, the exact same stubborn refusal to be ignored that he used against Nixon, Ford, and Reagan during the proxy wars of the 20th century, and he repurposed it to fight a massive global health crisis in the 21st century.
If we fast forward to 2014, Kaunda is 90 years old. He is still an active, beloved figure. He is center stage celebrating Zambia's 50th independence anniversary. He is enthusiastically leading the bid for Zambia to host the 2019 African Cup of Nations, a campaign that was especially poignant following the deeply emotional 2012 victory of the Zambian national soccer team, the Chipolopolo Boys.
He had evolved from a persecuted former leader into a universally hailed hero, both at home in Lusaka and abroad.
He simply outlasted everyone. He outlasted his domestic political critics, he outlasted the politicians who tried to strip his citizenship, and he certainly outlasted the white minority apartheid regimes that he sacrificed so much to dismantle.
When you look at the entirety of Kenneth Kaunda's life, the mechanical lessons are universally applicable. Whether you are a startup CEO dealing with a hostile boardroom, managing a complex community project, or navigating high-stakes global diplomacy, the playbook is clear.
Adaptability.
Extreme adaptability. It is the hard, unglamorous work of maintaining personal relationships across massive, seemingly insurmountable ideological divides. It is the willingness to sit down at the table with your enemies, whether that is the apartheid prime minister of South Africa or an American president who is actively ignoring your pleas. That stubborn persistence is the fundamental mechanism for long-term impact.
He was a man of deep convictions, but he never allowed his principles to become a rigid prison that prevented him from negotiating when his survival depended on it.
Exactly.
To quickly recap this incredible, sweeping historical arc, we started with the idealistic hopes shared with John F. Kennedy, crashed into the cold reality of LBJ's Vietnam distraction, and survived Nixon's outright neglect. We witnessed the aggressive, realpolitik maneuvering with Ford and Kissinger over the Angolan Civil War.
Then the moral highs and the devastating practical lows of Jimmy Carter's human rights agenda.
We unpacked the deeply frustrating mechanics of Chester Crocker's constructive engagement and linkage during the Reagan and Bush administrations. We watched Kaunda endure the painful, crushing birth of multi-party democracy in 1991, and finally, we saw his remarkable rebirth leading the vital humanitarian fight against HIV/AIDS.
And I think all of this leaves us with a highly provocative thought to mull over. Throughout his entire political life, Kenneth Kaunda was frequently and harshly criticized by the West for his willingness to negotiate with Marxist rebels and purchase Soviet weapons.
Right.
Later, he was harshly criticized by his own electorate for prioritizing the liberation of the continent over the health of the domestic economy. But if you look at a political map of southern Africa today, a region that is finally free of institutionalized white minority rule and apartheid, you have to ask, was Kaunda's stubborn, highly costly doctrine of non-alignment actually the most far-sighted, pragmatic strategy of the entire 20th century? When your very nation's survival is on the line, what does true mechanical political pragmatism really look like?
It fundamentally makes you rethink what it means to hold a weak hand in a high-stakes game. Think back to that startup CEO we talked about at the very beginning. Walking into that hostile boardroom year after year, facing a brand new slate of unpredictable investors, refusing to sell out the core mission of the enterprise, making agonizing compromises, and somehow, against all odds, keeping the doors open until you literally change the world.
It's an incredible legacy.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. Keep asking the hard questions, keep looking past the headlines to understand the mechanics of history, and we will catch you next time.